Is the great and abominable church Marxism? We're going to talk about it. Be sure that you subscribe and hit the bell so that you receive notifications on new episodes. This episode is brought to you by the Momentum Cruises. These are two cruises, one on the East Coast, one on the West. The East Coast, you're going to the Grand Cayman. You're going to Jamaica. You're going to the Bahamas. West Coast, Mexico, San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Francisco. There will be top-line LDS entertainers and speakers. Either of these cruises is a great opportunity to be around hundreds of other Latter-day Saints, enjoying yourself as you're fed spiritually while you have the opportunity to rest, relax in beautiful places, and be entertained by some great talent. And I'm emceeing both of the cruises. Go to cwicmedia.com, that's cwicmedia.com, scroll up to the top and click on trips and events and look for Momentum Cruises. It's coming up in March and April, so if you're looking for a getaway, I think this is a good option. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we bring back Dan Ellsworth. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, we are going to go there with this. We're going to go there. We're going to talk about, is Marxism the great and abominable church? And we're going to lay this out, bring up some scripture, delve into this a little bit. But first, I know that you got interested in this for a reason. Why are you interested in looking into and studying Marxism?
So a few years ago, I was invited to join a discussion group of Latter-day Saints and former Latter-day Saints and some people who were kind of in between, right? And the discussion group, those tend to not go very well. They tend to be pretty contentious, and I kind of knew that going in. But what I was not prepared for was there was a completely different vocabulary used by a lot of members of the church and former members. They kind of shared a different vocabulary, and I kind of understood what they were saying, but it seemed like any time we taught or promoted any gospel principles, they seemed to be countered with some combination of these terms and these ways of thinking around this vocabulary. And I'm talking about words like intersectionality, like systems of oppression, centering, marginalization, and this vocabulary. So I understood just the basic meanings of those terms, but the way that they were being used was, I could not actually have a productive conversation with anybody who were using those terms. You couldn't, it was almost, I sometimes use the metaphor of like a vat of acid, right? Any gospel principle that you teach, it just goes into this vat of acid. And it was really, honestly, it kind of messed with my head. This was spring of several years ago. And I left that group and I was just, I don't know, I was kind of overwhelmed and blindsided by the whole experience of getting exposure to this, I'm just going to come out and say it, a religious belief system, right? Mm-hmm. And I ended up fasting a lot to just, it felt like there was this toxic cloud in my mind after being in that group. And it went on, and I ended up fasting for days and days. I ended up fasting half of the month of April a few years ago. Like 15 days out of that month, I was fasting to try to get this toxic mess out of my head. But I didn't really know what it was, right? Until a couple of years ago, I started actually, I got some exposure to the work of James Lindsay and some others. And and James Lindsay in particular, his main approach to things is to just read Marxist literature
Yes.
and talk about it. He's like, here are their words. And then he offers a little bit of commentary here and there, but he's mostly just reading their words. And I was listening to his podcast, and all of a sudden that whole horrible experience made so much sense. And it just became so clear to me how, why it was so toxic and frustrating. It's because you're dealing with a different religious worldview. And even among people who call themselves Latter-day Saints, right? Once they've adopted this, I couldn't reach even members of the church and agree on like basic gospel concepts with them. So having that exposure through James Lindsay and some others, it led me to write some things for Public Square that kind of explored some of these dimensions of Marxism. And I went back and thought through, like, okay, I read the book Wild Swans when I was in college, which is a wonderful snapshot of Marxism in action in China, right? Mm-hmm. And how it works. And since then, it's been an area of interest for me because frankly, I want to counter its influence any way I can. It's kind of part of my mission in life, in the church, to be honest. So that's a little bit of background and context for it.
Okay, so that's great. I think that is the, I talk about this a lot, obviously, on the podcast, and it's, what I always get pushback on this. It's, well, this isn't really what it is. You don't really understand what's happening, Greg. I remember once, Dan, this was maybe 4 years ago. I had put out a podcast, and it was about some things seeping into BYU, and I had an English professor, a tenured English professor at BYU, come back at me saying that these things have nothing to do with Marxism. Critical race theory is only a legal theory, and I went back and forth, and then what I did is exactly that. I went back and I copied and pasted the contemporary authors that bring on Marxism and use it and say they use it and say they're Marxists, and this is what they use. And then you see the language that you're talking about, sprouting up around exactly what they're talking about as they are bringing their source material from Marx and Engels and Marcuse and Gramsci and others. Yeah. And it's like, no. And I put this out there, and then he just stopped. Yeah. Then he said, okay, he didn't have any rebuttal. Right. These things are happening, and this is the DNA from this that we're seeing today. The vocabulary, if we added in postmodernism, we add in radical feminism, which are all, they're still all rooted in the same thing. Yeah. But this is exactly what you were experiencing.
Well, one of the ways that people will try to confuse the issue, and sometimes maybe they don't even really know better, but what they'll do is they'll say, oh, Marxism is 19th century communism. And that's not what I'm preaching. That's not what I'm teaching. So I'm not a Marxist. And so if you come up with like a really narrow definition that's erroneous, by the way, of Marxism, then you can kind of squirm out of the reality that you're a Marxist, right? And so that's kind of a straw man, like, oh, I'm not that, I'm not one of these Stalinists or whatever. I can't relate to that. No, when we talk about Marxism, we're talking about a set of assumptions about how the world works.
It's a worldview.
It is a worldview. Absolutely. We're talking about a set of assumptions. We're talking about a system of thought that, and it did not have its origins with Karl Marx. It's ancient, right? Whenever I read in the Book of Mormon of the ancient plans around the acquisition of power, this comes to mind, right? I think and anyway, we can go a little bit further into that as we as we proceed. But I definitely see it in a lot of these scriptural accounts.
Right. So you start off, you'd given me a little bit of an outline of kind of what your thought process is on this. But first of all, you're talking about what Marxism. You've already said that it's not the same as communism, and people need to understand that. Sometimes people use that term communism.
Yeah.
And I get it. I understand. But there's what we deal with today, for example, is not the same thing, right? Communism is based on, a material economic class type of an environment, right? Though that is the victim versus oppressor.
Yeah.
What we deal with today is very cultural, and it has to do with race, and it has to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with the institutions of education and medicine and law and media. And this is how it conquers and divides and creates oppressor and victim. So communism is like Marxism 1.0.
Yeah.
If you, at least modern, right?
Yep.
Modern. It's a Marxism 1.0. Today, what we might call wokeness, or what I refer a little bit more into critical theory, this is 2.0. This is cultural. Why don't you go into a little bit of what you studied about Marx? Let's talk about his character. This is always important to understand, because the whole DNA behind where we're getting this is from characters that are very unsavory individuals.
Right.
Right. So talk a little bit about Marx himself.
Yeah. So Marx was born into a family that was Jewish, but they converted to Christianity. And depending on who you read, they'll say that some of the biographers are in disagreement on, was that conversion of their family before Marx was born, or was it after? And that's kind of neither here nor there. But what they are in agreement on is that his family converted to avoid persecution of Jews, right? And so they became Christian. It's interesting, he was in high school, and one of his teachers remarked that he was really good at articulating Christian faith. He would write papers and things, and he just seemed like a model student, right? But there came a point where something happened, and it was manifest in a project that he and his classmates were all tasked with doing, and it was a writing project. And in that project, Marx started using the word destroy. And he used the word destroy 6 times, and nobody else in the entire class used it in their paper. But for some reason, he started using this word destroy. And it actually became his nickname. His classmates, they referred to him as Destroy. That was his nickname. And so something happened within him where he just became fixated on destruction. And he gravitated, as time went on, he would read and internalize characters like in Goethe's play Faust, where you have this exploration of demonic influences, right? And Mephistopheles has this quote in that play: everything that exists should be destroyed. And Marx used to quote Mephistopheles at length, but he used that phrase a lot. So something happened in his mind where we sometimes talk about, well, what was his religious worldview? And it's a common answer that people give is to say that he was atheist, but that's not necessarily accurate. He was what we would call a misotheist, which, when you talk about an atheist, you're talking about somebody who does not believe in God, in the existence of God. Marx, he hinted at that sometimes, but when you look at language in plays that he wrote and things that he gravitated toward in terms of his influences and things he communicated. He was a misotheist, and that's someone who hates God. So a misotheist, even when he was articulating his economic philosophy, for example, you would think that that would be something that would be neutral about the existence of God and so forth. But Marx had a theology, and the idea was make God irrelevant, remove God from the equation, because he hates God, right? There's another, I've looked for a term and I cannot find it, but another way of describing what Marx thought was just hatred of reality. He hated that anything at all existed. This was sort of an all-consuming thing, to where at one point his father wrote him a letter and said, "I think you have a demon. I really think you actually are possessed." And as time went on, when you look at his behavior, and Greg, you and I have done past episodes talking about the demonic and the psychology of Satan, basically, right? This insecure, needy, God-hating, this psychology that demands equality, or I should say equity, right?
Equity.
Sameness. And if sameness can't occur, then differences need to be destroyed and eliminated. So like when you look at, for example, in communist countries where they embraced some of these assumptions that Marx held, you see what's called brutalist architecture. Have you ever seen that before?
Mm-hmm.
It's where buildings are just made ugly. And the idea is, don't make any beautiful buildings. Well, why not? Because there might be a building that's not as beautiful somewhere nearby. And then it's not fair to have
That's
beautiful.
all of Marxism. That is, let's bring everything down. Let's bring it down so that there is no disparity. Because if you equity requires tyranny in that sense. It requires to take away the beautiful. It requires to take away success. It requires to take away productivity. It requires all these things because if one is above another, then, and this is to an absolute extreme, right? Where they would go out and kill a farmer because he had an extra cow, or because his house was 20 square feet bigger than the neighbors.
Yep.
Right.
Everything
and they provided quotas in these things. And it was, that's at the core of this, is to break it down, break down the system so that everybody can be equal. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a core element of the Satanic worldview and the Marxist worldview.
So what do you mean by the Satanic worldview there?
In the scriptures, we get glimpses of Satan's worldview, this demand for equity, saying not one soul will be lost. He said that in pre-existence, right? Just this insane preoccupation with equity. Also jealousy, just a real deep jealousy of the Father and the Christ. Like how
envying and coveting.
Yeah, and viewing everything in terms of power relationships. If God has glory and I don't, then there's a power imbalance that needs to be remedied. Mm-hmm. And how am I going to remedy that? I'm going to destroy everything. I'm going to destroy everything that God creates, because if anything adds to his glory, I can't allow that, because I'm so insanely jealous, right? You get these glimpses of Satan's psychology in the scriptures, in the temple endowment, in lots of places. And that is, it would be very inaccurate, I think, to say that Marx was a Satan worshiper. I've heard some people say that, and I say, no, that's a mischaracterization. Mm-hmm. But he is somebody who shared kind of, these elements of a satanic worldview and these assumptions about how the world works, how the universe should be, you know. So in that sense, I say I hate saying he was satanic, because again, people might gravitate toward this idea of a Satan worshiper, which he was
Right.
not,
Yeah.
right? But he definitely, in his writings and in his poetry, you see him just identifying with the figure who fell in Isaiah 14. How art thou fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning? This comes up in Marx's poetry. And so it's not Satan worship, but it's kind of an identification. Like that's how we should be, right?
It's or an adoption.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's interesting you say that. You know, I wonder that's a great point, because, I mean, that would be a great testimony question. Even that would be a great theological question. Period. Is, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody express it, but what was Satan's worldview? What is his worldview, and how would you put that together? So if you said, okay, I want you to write down, I don't know if we'd ever do this in Sunday school, but write down on a sheet of paper based on scriptures, what is his worldview? What would you deduce from this? Right? From these scriptures, what would the worldview be? And then, because we need to do that, because you've got to understand what the mists of darkness are. Yeah. I believe. I think an awareness is key of what these philosophies of men are, so that you and your family are not pulled into them. Right? You gotta know what you're stepping into. Yeah. And to know that, I think that is a great point. A question that should be asked is, what is Satan's worldview? Yeah, you actually in the Restoration, you get the most full and rich glimpse of Satan's psychology, his worldview, his intentions, his assumptions. I'm going to read a couple of quotes, and these are from people who were in Marx's circle. Okay, so one of them is Mikhail Bakunin, and he was an associate of Karl Marx. And I want to read what he says about Satan. Okay. He says, here steps in Satan, the eternal rebel, the first free thinker and the emancipator of worlds. He makes man ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience. He emancipates him, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity in urging him to disobey and eat of the fruit of knowledge. So that's not Satan worship, but it's Satan kind of idolizing. Right? Like, wow, this amazing character that we can emulate, right? Mm-hmm. Here's another, but true.
Yeah. So here's another associate of Karl Marx who was an influence on him, William Godwin. He said, why did Satan rebel against his maker? It was, as he himself informs us, because he saw no sufficient reason for that extreme inequality of rank and power which the Creator assumed.
He nailed it.
Yeah. So these are people in Marx's circle.
Yeah.
And between this and Marx's satanic poetry, where you have all these allusions that echo Isaiah 14 and some of these other kind of satanic themes, you get a picture. Again, it's erroneous to say that they were Satan worshipers, but they did idolize him. They thought he was cool. They thought he was edgy and someone worth emulating. So in that sense, that's why when I talk about Marx being satanic, that is what I'm referring.
Yeah, we need a new word for Satanism or satanic.
Right. Satan revering, or I don't know what to say, but you can tell they really did revere him.
Yeah, they Satan theory.
Yeah. So this is part of that satanic worldview, right? Modern Satanism, you have Blanche Barton, who's a leader in the Church of Satan, saying the idea of worshiping Satan is ridiculous. We worship ourselves first and foremost. And we use the satanic as a metaphor for calling forth the powers within ourselves that we find enriching or enlivening. That is the satanic worldview, right?
Yeah, it's pride. That goes directly to pride in that case, and I think it's antithetical to the doctrine of Christ, number one, right. And it is, it's always interesting to think about that worldview that he has and that egalitarianism, equal outcomes, which has to be forced. There's no other way to do it.
Right.
Right. Forced equal outcomes requires tyranny, and it requires a loss of agency.
Well, that's the interesting thing is when you listen to Marxists talk about their ideal implementation of that belief system, they never talk about a tyrant. Because they have this vision that, it can be done with everybody having equal status and power and stuff. Yet every time they actually, boots on the ground, nuts and bolts, try to implement Marxism, they end up with the worst tyrants in the history of the world. And I mean, Hitler was bad. There's no question about it. But like in terms of just the
suffering and death.
Yeah, suffering and death. You cannot touch, Marxists. You just can't touch them. They do suffering and death. And in these movements, these Marxist movements, you see the emergence of the worst tyrants. I mean, horrible, horrible tyrants. So that's kind of a lie that is sold to people is, this can be done without tyranny. No, it can't.
Yeah, another thing that there's a lie is you'll go back and you'll hear a lot of people that are trying to be a little bit apologetic about, 19th or 20th century Marxism. And they say, well, Lenin, he wasn't that bad, or you had Stalin and Mao. Well, they were just power hungry. Yeah. And they used this as a way of getting their power.
Right.
And, look, power is certainly a part of it, right? Give me all your glory.
Yeah.
But again, if you actually read the source material, you read who they are from their own mouths. Yeah. These people are complete converts. They are religious zealots for Marxism.
Yeah.
They are hook, line, and sinker. Yeah. So much so that they kill and murder and starve people to bring about this religious utopia, I would say, that they're working toward, right? Hegel called it an Aufhoben. It's they believe that anything, all means are acceptable to reach the end.
Right. And one of the weird things, one of the absolute twisted things about Marxist societies is that they have to force people to stay geographically in, behind walls in their Marxist society. Hey, we've built this Marxist utopia. You can't leave it. We're not going to let you ever leave it. We're going to, and I love this quote. This is from Paul Kengor. He said, so restrictive was communism in the 20th century that its implementers routinely refused to allow citizens the right to exit, that is, escape the destructive systems imposed within their borders. In some cases, they erected walls to herd and fence in the masses they claimed to champion. That bears repeating. So restrictive was communism that its advocates had to build walls poured with cement, topped with barbed wire, patrolled 24/7 by secret police with automatic weapons turned on their own citizenry to keep their people from fleeing. That's incredible. I mean, imagine if a revolution started and one of their initial selling points as they're going out trying to win converts was, once we do this, you will not be allowed to leave. How many people do you think would go along with it? Like, we're going to build walls. You will not be able to leave here ever. And that's what they did in society after society. That's incredible. That's astounding. Why would you have to keep people in? Right?
Well, drag you slowly by chains into captivity.
Right. And it's a brutal captivity. One of the things that we saw with Maoist China, for example, we talk about the destruction of the family. And a lot of people don't understand that Marxism is actively hostile toward the family as an institution. Under Mao, they broke up families and they marched children out to the countryside, broke them away from their parents. They did these really perverse things in Russia and China, where they would incentivize children to actually turn on their parents and get them incarcerated, right? They would actually hold them up as heroes when they did that. So it was incredible, the effect that Marxism, these Marxist movements had on families where they've been implemented. And that's something that a lot of people may not be aware of. The current leader of China was one of those kids who was broken away from his family. Mm-hmm. And look at him. I mean, the guy has no qualms, unleashing horror. He has no qualms about it. That, you think about the effects of what he experienced as a kid, it probably messed him up a lot, which is why we see this.
So, coming to really the crux of what we're talking about here, how is this the great and abominable church spoken of by the angelic host with Nephi?
So as we begin to answer that question, I want to tell your viewers and listeners, please don't go to gospel doctrine and repeat what I'm about to say. Okay? This is my view. I happen to believe it's true, but don't take it as gospel doctrine. It's the way that I interpret these passages. Okay. Now, when we talk about the great and abominable church and the two churches, right, in Nephi's apocalyptic visions, we have these words. This word church is important to understand, because we, in our day, when we think of the word church, we think of an actual institution that has filed, bylaws with a government agency to say, hey, we're a church. We have nonprofit status. We think of an actual organization with a hierarchy and so forth. I think, and I think in the past, there has been a lot of speculation about, okay, what is the great and abominable church? And some people said, oh, it's the Catholic Church, and they would point to an institution. And fortunately, our view of that has become more intelligent. It has expanded to a great degree. And it's a lot more accurate to think of the great and abominable church as a system, right? It's a system that works together to undermine God's purposes in the world. And
a system that would be manifesting an ideology. I mean, eventually, you've got to have a Geist that is influencing this.
Right. So what are the elements of this system? Well, the scriptures say that it comes about among the nations of the Gentiles, right? So check. We know that's true of Marxism. It slayeth the saints of God, right? Marxism has always persecuted the religious, persecuted Christians. The devil, he was the founder of it. We talked about just kind of the satanic psychology and assumptions about egalitarianism and just the hatred of power, the hatred of differences, and all of those kinds of things. And I think those are a really good description of, what it means for the devil to be the founder of something. Something actually shares his views, his attitude toward God and humanity, right? So the gold and silver, silks and scarlets and fine twined linen and precious clothing and harlots are the desires of this great and abominable church. Now, neo-Marxist movements, they tend to be very hedonistic, right? So, for example, you look at a pride parade, right, which has the pride movement has very strong Marxist underpinnings. Queer theory and all of these other things. They're very much outgrowths of Marxist thought. And one of the other things, well, what about wealth and riches, like it talks about in First Nephi? Well, Marxist movements, that's the thing. They claim to not be about the acquisition of wealth. But when their elites kind of solidify their power over the population, they get really, really wealthy compared to their populations. So you have like Joseph Stalin showing up to meet with world leaders, and he's dressed in, this common workers attire to show, oh, I'm one of the common people. I'm one of the little guys. I can relate to them, unlike, Churchill here and and these other world leaders. But man, he was so much more wealthy than any of those other world leaders. He amassed so much wealth to himself, and that's what they tend to do, right? So again, there's kind of this claim of the movement, oh, we're not in it for the money. Well, but when it actually solidifies, they get very wealthy, the people who are kind of steering these movements. So that's another one that I think fits pretty well. But then we have in 1 Nephi 13:26, we have this passage that I think I have kind of a different interpretation than most people. And it talks about the formation of the great and abominable church, and they have taken away from the gospel of the Lamb many parts which are plain and most precious. And this is talking about after scriptures go from the hands of the Jews to Gentiles, right? Then there are taken away elements of scripture that are plain and precious. Now, what would that mean? Well, some people think that it's modifications to scripture that happened, during the biblical periods. Some people might say, oh, it's the Deuteronomist school, importing some Greek thought or what, I don't know, importing some Gentile notions of things into scripture. I'm not going to discount that completely. That may have some truth to it. But we can see in our day critical biblical scholarship, okay, that arose very heavily in Germany, right? German scholarship arose and started absolutely destroying people's traditional understanding of the Bible. And with very Marxist underpinnings over time, a lot of these biblical scholars adopted the Marxist view that religion needs to be criticized. Marx said he said criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. Okay, that is one of his most famous statements. Religion is the opiate of the masses. So you have to criticize religion. That's your starting point if you're going to criticize everything else. So you have this field called critical biblical scholarship. And what has it done over time? Well, it has undermined people's confidence in the biblical text. It has undermined people's understanding of the witness of the prophets in the Bible. It has destroyed those things. It has taken away very plain and precious understanding of the gospel. Critical biblical scholarship has done this. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There was a biblical writer or biblical scholar named Robert Oden, and he wrote a book giving a fantasy kind of view of, can we do the Bible? Can we study the Bible without any theology, right? Without any claims about God. So he wrote a book called The Bible Without Theology, which is kind of insane. And he was critiqued by another Bible scholar named Edgar Conrad. And he said, Oden has overstated his case here by ignoring the role played by other ideologies, such as Marxism and feminism in the university. He has also failed to see that his own positivistic reading, which is a reading of the Bible where you kind of dismiss the possibility of miracles or try to just kind of bracket that out. He says it's no more objective than historical criticism, but is in fact another form of confessional reading. So this other Bible scholar comes in and says, look, if you're going to try to do that, you have to be honest and say that you have your own faith commitments. You can't remove theology from the Bible. If you're bringing your own theology in the form of Marxism or these other things. I love that quote because it's one scholar who's kind of keeping another scholar honest. He's saying you can't just pretend that you don't bring anything to the Bible, right?
And again, it supports the idea that, as you say, he wants to take theology out of it, but he is using the theology of Marxism.
Yes.
Right. And so it just goes along and supports the idea that, look, Marxism is a religion. Marxism is a worldview, right? Yeah. There is a theology to it. It may be godless, but it is a view of the world to the point of what is our purpose? How should we live? How do we get along with each other? Right. What is, what the purpose of life and suffering? All of these things are accounted for. Becoming the new man is part of Marxism, right? Just like for Christianity, there's the idea of becoming. For them, it's a corrupted version, but it's still very, very much focused on who you're becoming and how you're going to become that individual.
Right. And now if you bracket God and you say God is irrelevant, or if you just take an atheist stance and say God does not exist, therefore we can read the Bible without, pretending that he exists. Each of those are theological claims. You cannot do the Bible without making implicit theological claims. You can't. But here's an interesting quote, and it's from a Bible scholar named David Klein. And in 1976, he wrote a book all about Isaiah 53. So Isaiah 53 is the greatest witness testimony of the atonement of Christ in all of the Old Testament, right? He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. With his stripes we are healed, and so forth, right? I mean, plain and precious witness testimony of Christ from the prophet Isaiah. And here's what David Klein said in his 1976 book. He said, Isaiah 53 has become a casualty of historical critical scholarship. It is not the only biblical text in that plight, but its injuries are more grave than those of many others. Why? Why would so many Bible scholars gravitate toward Isaiah 53 as the focus of their attack in their historical criticism? Why that chapter? Why not Isaiah 20? Why not Jeremiah 5? Why would Isaiah 53 draw so much focused fire? It's because they're trying to remove a plain and precious truth from the Bible. That's why. And the historical critical method, it's an amazing tool for doing that. It has destroyed massive amounts of testimonies, of convictions among Christians since its implementation. It's incredible how devastating the historical critical method has been. And again, it's all under this pretense of, oh, we bracket God. No, you can't. You cannot bracket God out of your analysis of the Bible. To do so is to make a theological claim about God's existence and his relevance and so forth. So those are all elements of, the great and abominable church described in 1 Nephi 13. And I think there's some very, very strong correspondence.
Yeah. And again, as you said, church in Greek, what is it? Ecclesian? Ecclesian, I think it just means a congregation, an assembly, a number of people. And that's typically what you look at. But it's interesting as you say this, there is a light, right? Which is Christianity, which is the truth. And everything else that goes against that light is simply, in that case, a reaction to it. It is a justification of something else. How do I justify a different reality? Right? It's like saying, well, gravity exists, but how do I pretend it doesn't? Right? Well, how do we liberate ourselves? That's what the focus of Marxism really is how do I liberate myself and take off the shackles of an order of God, of natural law, and say, this is my reality. To me, to get, because the DNA of all of this, all of them say the same thing. It is, let's throw off the shackles of natural law and the order of God, and then we will be the new man.
Yep.
And we will be one with reality at that point.
Yeah, and we can do this without God, right? That's the idea. And so you have these, and it's interesting that years ago, Jonah Goldberg wrote a book called Liberal Fascism. And he said, it's a misunderstanding to portray fascism as in opposition to Marxism. They're family.
It's a European trope.
They're family. Fascism and Marxism are family, and that's why they hate each other so much. They're like these squabbling siblings is what they are. But both of them have this basic premise. We can achieve a perfect utopian society without God. They're just fighting over how to do it. One of them, fascism, says it's blood and soil. Marxism said it's, equity. And, I think it's accurate to say that fascism is kind of a male version and Marxism is a female version of the same thing, right? They really are kind of the same thing. So Jonah Goldberg, his book, Liberal Fascism, is a really great resource for understanding that. But you said a minute ago, Greg, you talk about Christianity and everything else. Well, in 1 Nephi 14, we have this discussion of the two churches. Well, how can we characterize these things as just two, right? Well, it's, again, if you think of churches as systems, two sets of assumptions and two sets of ideas and worldviews, the Marxist, what we've been observing, and this has been kind of amazing, and I don't think people really understood this until very recently, is that Marxism gobbles up everything else. And I think over time, we're going to see kind of a continuation of this, where people who used to consider themselves progressive now are like, wait a minute, I don't know what that is, because I'm not a Marxist. So what am I now? Or people who consider themselves just classical liberals or just liberals in general, And a lot of them are like, wait a minute, I am not Marxism. And Marxism is devouring everything that I used to belong to. In academia, in politics and everything. I mean, it devours everything. It cannot tolerate rivals. So I see a lot of consolidation of kind of rival forms of thinking under that umbrella of Marxism. It's devouring them. But I also see, I mean, you had James Lindsay on your show recently. How interesting is it to see James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson sit down like they did a while ago and talk about scripture in a way that you just can't believe, like, how accurate and their insights are. You're like, wow. So in another sense, there's almost another consolidation happening where 10 years ago, if I had met somebody like James Lindsay, I would have said, I don't know if I can relate to this person at all. But nowadays we're like, man, he feels like family, sort of, in a sense. He's seeing so many of the same things that we are. And like a lot of people are doing that. People who are not necessarily members of the church, but who are like really, really accurately describing gospel realities to an extent that's pretty shocking, right?
Yeah, I think what happens, Dan, this is my take on that, is that we're at an axial time in history. And what I mean by that is what's happening right now in the West, especially in the US, but really in the West as a whole, with really these Marxian thoughts and worldviews starting to, I mean, look, they've taken over almost every institution in the United States already. I mean, they are the power behind almost every institution in the United States right now. And this creates a watershed moment for people. And it's like, okay, well, I've been a liberal and I'm leaning left. Well, am I going to have more of my heartstrings tugged that kind of draws me into this equity idea? Or am I more anchored in the Enlightenment with a lot of liberals, right? And in the Enlightenment that is focused on science, and a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and biology is in place, and where you get a good portion, not all of it, because the Enlightenment definitely pushed off on religion, but where you get a good portion of Americanism, right? And the philosophy of Americanism comes from the Enlightenment and Christianity, I think, as a whole, bringing them together. And so they shift. You've got Jonathan Haidt, you've got Steven Pinker, Harris, right? All these guys that are atheists, Bill Maher, that are atheists, that are all of a sudden turning away from this, and really their classical liberal roots are shining a lot more as they push away from what's kind of happening on one end. Where on the other end, you also have, and especially because today you've got, some people trying to push away from Trump, and you've got people saying also, well, my heartstrings are getting tugged, and the LGBTQ issues and other things, the equity here, the compassion, I believe it's a short-term compassion, but the compassion is what's going to pull me over here where I have always been over here. Yeah. So this demographic shift is as you're describing here, really is, I think it's going to continue quite a bit. I think, for example, and this is crazy, but I think Utah, for example, is going to be a blue state soon.
I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised at all. This consolidation is really interesting, and I love this quote from Ezra Taft Benson. He gave a talk called "I Testify" in October 1988 conference, and it's one of my favorite conference talks of all time. He said, "I testify that as the forces of evil increase under Lucifer's leadership, and as the forces of good increase under the leadership of Jesus Christ, there will be growing battles between the two until the final confrontation. As the issues become clearer and more obvious, all mankind will eventually be required to align themselves either for the kingdom of God or for the kingdom of the devil. As these conflicts rage, either secretly or openly, the righteous will be tested. God's wrath will soon shake the nations of the earth and will be poured out on the wicked without measure. but God will provide strength for the righteous and the means of escape. And eventually and finally, truth will triumph. So this is extraordinary. He's talking about, he says, over time, as the issues become clearer and more obvious, you'll see realignments. That's what he said in 1988. And I think in my lifetime, I've never seen more realignment. People who I could not have imagined being aligned with in in any number of things are sounding like our best friends, right? People who are not necessarily of our faith, but they see this clarity is coming and people are recognizing it. And I think that is going to continue, and it's probably going to surprise us how that develops over time.
Do you think, Dan, that the idea of, let's go into this a little bit. You talked about, Marxism doesn't start with Marx. That's just what we call it.
Yeah.
Right. In our modern vernacular, but it's always existed. And you've got some examples here of prophecy and things coming from the Book of Mormon. Let's go over that first and talk about things more anciently.
Yeah.
Where do we see not Marxism really, and not critical, it's actually more critical theory, but it's
right.
Where do we see elements of this anyway in Scripture?
Oh dear, the Book of Mormon. The Gadiantons, Kishkumen. You are seeing the tactics of the Maoist rebels, right? In the Book of Mormon, and I go back to that language of the ancient plans around the acquisition of power. And it is interesting how, once again, I think it's a huge mistake to say that fascism and Marxism are opposed to each other. They really, when you actually read history and you read what these movements were about and their socialist kind of common ancestry, right? And the ways that they operated, they sound indistinguishable in a lot of ways. They just have they're just kind of different flavors of the same thing. But in Scripture, it's the Book of Mormon. That's where you see it probably most strongly, I think. But
it's written for our day, right?
It is written for our day. What I say about Marx is he did not invent something new. He systematized things that already existed. He just kind of brought them together in a way that people they could say, okay, this is a system. Whereas all these threads, they've been going on throughout history forever. These are the ancient plans around the acquisition of power. But he systematized them. He kind of made it, hey, here is one handbook that you can turn to. Instead of looking to, this ancient behavior and this, the French Revolution was a huge influence on Marx and Hitler and all of these tyrants but he just took these threads and kind of wove them together into one thing. That's all he did. It's not new. Marxism is not new. It is ancient.
I would even argue that it's been systematized before in other ways. I think that with Marx, one thing, let's go back to the very beginning when you said you got interested in Marxism. You're hearing a language.
Yeah.
Right. And so he provided a language and a thought system, right? The language has to go along with that.
Yep.
You cannot communicate this and share it and spread it without language.
Yeah.
And so he was able to articulate certain things for the time. And it was very effective in places, especially where there were a bunch of peasants.
Yep.
And major conflict with the kings and the royalty and whatnot. And it's still effective in those places, right? It still can be very effective there. But I think it has been systematized previously. It's just a little different with him. He provided a better language than even some of his almost immediate predecessors.
Right.
And then was able to, he was able to spread it with him, with praxis, with the pregnant idea of you have to be an activist.
Yeah.
With this, or you were not true to it at all.
Yeah.
I think that was a big part of creating kind of this virus that was able to spread and spread very quickly.
That's all it is. It's not new. Marxism was not invented by Marx. It is not new. It has existed for a long time. It has worn different clothing. It's been in various different disguises. It has adapted itself to different contexts throughout the historical record, but it is absolutely not new. It has existed since ancient times. It's always existed.
It's always, Cain and Abel was brought up before. It's the same idea there, same human nature, and maybe amplifying, a way to amplify and codify and articulate certain human desires. And a couple things here that brought up. I want to finish with this. There's you brought up. Let's see. This is 1 Nephi 13:26, where it says that many parts which are plain and most precious were they were removed, and then it says immediately after that, and also many covenants of the Lord.
Yeah.
And so to me, when I see that, that immediately takes me to the temple.
Yeah.
And elsewhere in the scriptures, it seems very apparent to me that along with the doctrine, this doctrine fits under these covenants that I think overall is just my view here, that it overall is the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
And so if you think about what is the Abrahamic covenant, what does it mean? Well, it's your agency to move toward Christ. Just think of the temple. It is marriage.
Yeah.
It is Zion and community.
And Marx
and Christ is at the very center of all of it.
Yep. And Marx has his own covenant framework too.
Yeah, exactly.
He has his own covenant framework.
It's a corruption, and it's okay. How do I react to that? How do I'm against family.
Yeah.
I'm going to, split parents from kids and push, ideologies that are against the family. I'm going to push away on anything that would support the doctrine of Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
And you're going to become an activist and for the revolution, and that's the covenant. So I guess one of the things that I thought about earlier that I want to share with your listeners is if you want to see the opposite of the Marxist vision for making a society better, look at BYU Pathway. If you want to see the opposite, like the counter to Marxist thinking about how you make the world a better place, BYU Pathway is perfect in every way. You bring people in and you give them an affordable opportunity to make their own lives better and lift people around them and take responsibility and create order out of the chaos in their lives. That's the opposite.
Yeah. And you get to, honestly, you get to bypass some of the Marxist temples.
Correct.
Universities.
Correct. And that's one of the beautiful things about it.
I agree. I am hoping and praying for the success of that program. I think eventually it may just be the answer.
Yeah.
I agree. For education.
Yeah. But it is the opposite of Marxism. If you want to see like the perfect contrast, look at BYU Pathway. Okay.
Dan, is there anything else you wanted to get in before we end here?
Nope. Great discussion. But once again, don't go teaching this. Don't give a talk in church about Marxism.
Don't write the title of this video up on the whiteboard.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, but I think it's a good discussion. And again, I think it's what's really key. And, this is something you've thought a lot about and to be able to make people aware. I think that's important. It goes right to what President Ezra Taft Benson said here in his quote that you said. And it's as things become clearer, well, if your head's in the sand and you don't know what's going on, You're not going to have the opportunity to make a choice.
Yeah.
You're not going to have an opportunity to make an educated choice, at least, right? And so I think that clarity here is crucial. Really appreciate your thoughts, Dan. We want to bring you back and talk about some other things. I'm going to put a reference, by the way, in the video when you bring it up to the other discussion that we had.
Okay.
Which was very interesting as well. But thanks so much, and till next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care.